Hi everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shaheen. I'm part of the MFest team, and we're so glad that you're here with us especially when it's cold and miserable and rainy outside. So I hope you're comfortable with a lovely cup of tea. Just a few things for British Library. So there's a menu above that you can provide us with feedback on the event. So please do share your feedback with us, and you can click on the bookshop tab for an opportunity to browse and buy books from our guests. You can find social media links below the video, and if you want to continue conversation on other platforms, please do. You can find out more about this event and other MFest events at mfest.org, and you can tweet us at MFest UK and on Instagram at MFest_UK. So there's also a link there to ask and send in questions, so please do that. And on to today's event, or this afternoon's event, we're really excited to be hosting Coming of Age in YA Literature. It's so important that our stories by us and for us are centered. Thinking about what's happening at the moment, we're seeing how speaking out about apartheid and settler colonialism in Palestine is leading to school children being silenced at school, children being sent home and excluded and shouted at by their teachers, and schools are supposed to be safe spaces for learning and exploration, and it's quite scary that the opposite is happening. But this shows again just how important our stories are and how important it is that we make space for them, we share them, and we celebrate them. So I'm going to hand over to our chair now. Our chair is Sofia Rehman. She's chairing this conversation, and Dr. Sofia Rehman, I should say, is an academic specializing in Islam and gender and the founder and coordinator of Leeds Lit Club, which is now in its 7th year. During the global pandemic, she launched the Islam and Gender read-alongs, in which she facilitates readings of academic texts penned by Muslim female scholars in conversation with a global virtual audience. You can connect with her on her Instagram, Sophia_reading, where she talks about all things related to books, faith, and academia.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Shaheen for that wonderful introduction, grounding today's session in the wider context which we are all observing and feeling the repercussions of, and highlighting once more for us all the importance of today's discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce each of our wonderful panelists. First, we have Sabina Khan. She is the author of Zara Hossain is Here and The Love and Lies of Rukshana Ali. She is an educational consultant and a karaoke enthusiast. After living in Germany, Bangladesh, Macau, Illinois, and Texas, she has finally settled down in beautiful British Columbia, Canada, with her husband, 2 daughters, and, quote, the best puppy in the world. Next, we have S.K Ali, Sajida. She is the author of Saints and Misfits, a finalist for the American Library Association's 2018 William C. Morris Award, winner of the APALA Honor Award and Middle East Book Honor Award. She's also the author of Love from A to Z, an NBC Today show's Read with Jenna book club selection. Both novels were critically acclaimed and named Best YA Books of the Year by various media, including Entertainment Weekly and Kirkus Reviews. Her newest novel, Misfit in Love, comes out on May 25th, so it's only 2 days from now. Sajida is also the co-editor of the critically acclaimed middle grade anthology, Once Upon an Eid, and co-author of the New York Times best-selling picture book, The Proudest Blue. She has a degree in creative writing from York University and lives in Toronto with her family, which includes a very vocal cat named Yeti. So maybe we will have a cameo from Yeti. And our third panelist is Hanna Alkaf. Hanna is the author of the Freeman Award-winning The Weight of Our Sky and the Kirkus Prize finalist, The Girl and the Ghost. She graduated with a degree in journalism from Northwestern University and spent over 10 years writing everything from B2B marketing emails to investigative feature articles, from non-profit press releases to corporate brochures. She now spends her time making it up as she goes along, both as an author of fiction and as a mum. Hanna lives in Kuala Lumpur with her family, and her next book is the upcoming YA mystery Queen of the Tiles. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. And I know that we're all zooming in from different time zones as well. So thank you for making the time in your days on this Sunday, and to everybody who's watching us as well. So let's just dive straight in. What I'm really interested in is what brought each of you to writing YA novels, and what your hopes and fears were stepping into this genre with such strong Muslim representation. So if we don't mind, Sabina, can I come to you first?
Sure. So yeah, I'm sure as Sajida and Hannah as well, when we were growing up, we did not see representation that, you know, of characters who looked like us, stories about our lives that, you know, resembled anything, any kind of the experiences that we were going through. And I didn't see myself represented in a story until I was 26 years old, and that's really too late. And then when my daughters were growing up, I realized they were reading young adult books where, again, they didn't see them, any characters who looked like them or lived like them. And for me, it was important when I began to write that, you know, I wanted to write stories and represent the voices that they did not get to see, because everyone deserves to see themselves in the stories that they read.
Thank you. And Hanna, if I could come to you next.
Sure. As Sabina said, I started writing young adult because those are some of the books. That's the age where I read some of the books that have impacted me and shaped me most. And when you grow up like us, and particularly I speak from my own context living in Malaysia, where most of the books that I read in English growing up were books that were published in the West and were brought over here. You learn to find bits and pieces of yourself in characters, but you never really see yourself fully in anything that you read. So you learn to find, you know, bits of yourself in Jo March or in Hermione or whatever your character of choice is, Anne of Green Gables. But you never see people who look like you or communities that look like yours. And that's definitely one of the reasons that I started writing YA at all. But the second part of your question, I think, was how it felt to step into this space with strong Muslim characters. And I confess that perhaps I was naive, but I didn't realize that I would be taking on that mantle of representation, if that makes sense. I set out to tell stories. First and foremost. And that's really all that I had set out to do. But I remember realizing early on, before my book had even come out, that I wasn't just standing in for me anymore, that I was standing in for Southeast Asians, for Malaysians, and then it just kept getting more specific, you know, Southeast Asians, Malaysians, Malay people, and Muslim people specifically. And I remember having a conversation with Sajida early on where we talked about this and how when there's so few of us, we have to stand in for all of us. And so that became a thing that I had to become very aware of very early on, because this gives everything that you write and say and do a certain weight that I'm not sure all authors have to deal with, and especially not as debuts. So it was a strange and startling realization to come to realize that I, as one person with one experience, suddenly would become representative of so much more than just me.
Thank you, Hanna. Yeah, I mean, wow, what you just said there, when there are so few of us, you stand for all of us, which is maybe something we can circle back to talk about the importance of more voices. Sajida, if I could come to you with the same question.
Yes, thank you. So my answer is kind of reflects both Sabina and Hanna. But in terms of just the YA space, I've always loved YA since it was, kind of defined. I don't know what the exact year was, but growing up, reading Judy Blume, which I would say, really was YA in the early definition of YA. I've always loved it into adulthood. And the first story I was writing, in terms of themes and the voice, it was natural to write it as a YA novel. But in terms of Muslim representation, so this is personally a topic that has fascinated me since I was very young. I actually remember as a preteen watching TV and having this aha that what I saw on screen and in greater society did not reflect my experience as a North American Muslim. And after that aha, it almost became like an investigation for me, just from a very early age of like trying to figure out why there was such a disconnect, why there was such a gap between being seen as terrorists and or oppressed or oppressive in popular culture. So by the time I got to university, I read Orientalism by Edward Said, and was beginning to understand that it was like a historically rooted process, othering vast numbers of people, including Muslims in the world. Then university really exposed me to writers and thinkers who were challenging that and writing against that. And so it just sealed my pursuit of taking back my right to define my experiences as free of the external gaze as you can get. Like we're never going to be totally free of the gaze of our society. And then like Hanna, I love stories, and I love how, Hanna, we talked about this before, that that sort of responsibility becomes a burden when it's like you're expected to speak for everyone. Because when I set out to write my first novel, I wasn't setting out to, either, correct things in society about Muslims. I wasn't setting out to tell a Muslim story when there was there wasn't all these like weighty responsibilities in my head. I was just telling a story, but with the understanding that of all these things in society, and of having been erased and having been misrepresented, malrepresented. So all of those were part of my thinking, but I was still writing a story as somebody who loves stories and who's a reader and a writer.
Wow, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. So staying on the theme of disrupting the single narrative, I think we're all very familiar now with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's famous quote where she talks about the dangers of a single story. And for so long, as you've all in your own way iterated, it's felt like there has only been one single story about Muslims. And again, as you've all alluded to, it's not always been a flattering narrative, to say the least. Each one of you really disrupts that singular narrative and enriches the tapestry of Muslim representation. So Sajida, you give us a story in Love from A to Z that really centers sort of chronic illness, grief, and convert Muslim representation, which is rare as well. Sabina gives us queer Muslim representation through two very different stories. And Hanna, you give us an important lesson in Malaysian history and mental health. So I'd like to come to Sabina and Sajda first. Your stories are both centered on young Muslim women in the diaspora. And whilst you have these strong female Muslim protagonists leading the way, you don't sugarcoat, nor do you romanticize the Muslim community either. So I'm curious to know, how did you navigate writing authentic and hopeful stories whilst also not denying the challenges that are faced by these young Muslims from within their own communities, but also doing that in a way that didn't validate, nor did you reference at any point the negative narratives that already exist about Muslims? So maybe if I come to Sabina first and then to Sajda.
Sure, thank you. So I think for both my stories, I for each of them, I wanted to come from two different angles, so to speak. So with The Love and Lives of Rukshana Ali, it was a coming out story, or kind of a forced coming out for Rukshana. And while her own parents handled it horribly, she did find so many supporters and allies in her own community, her grandmother, her brother, her friends, who are all Muslims. And, you know, her grandmother is of a different generation, and yet she was able to, you know, accept Rukshana with, you know, in whatever identity she was, you know, wanting to live in. And I also wanted to really emphasize that there is homophobia in every community, and it's not something that is, you know, somehow unique to certain religions or certain communities. And to pretend, and at the same time to pretend that this dark side doesn't exist also in every community, I think that's doing a disservice to our youth. I mean, if we don't acknowledge the ugliness, then we can't ever erase it, or, you know, or bring some light into that issue. And I think it's not, as a writer, I don't think it's my job to create a utopia in about my community, kind of, you know, to create this this false image, or unrealistic image of my own community. And yes, there is, you know, we as authors, we run the risk of having somebody point out that, oh yes, I knew it, you know, Muslims are all like this, or, you know, whoever they're talking about. And the thing is that that is something that, you know, you can't control what every single person is going to interpret or take from that. And as Hanna and Sajida said, it's impossible for us to represent every single story, or, you know, to even be, and I don't think it's fair for us to even be expected to carry that burden. But this is one single story about one girl who had this experience. And even within that experience, she found there were a lot of dark things, but she also found so much love and so much light. And it was important for me, for her to be able to find allies in her own community, so that, you know, it does, because allies exist in all communities, as do people who are, you know, intolerant and vicious and ugly. And with Zara Hossain, it was really important for me to represent, like, I found so much joy in writing her parents, because they're such loving, unconditionally loving parents, who just embrace their daughter as she is, and don't place any sort of expectations and conditions on their love for her. And it just brought me so much joy to write that, because again, those parents exist as well, you know, in real life. And I think that's something that we really have to, you know, you mentioned the dangers of a single story. That's so relevant in these cases, because I mean, again, these are only two stories that I've written. There are countless other versions, variations of even those stories. And I think readers and young people deserve to see all of those stories, because their experiences might be somewhat similar to Zara's and Rukshana's. They might be very different, but I mean, to feel seen, we need to have so many more books, so many more stories like this. And I'm grateful that I get to do this at this point in my life. And, you know, I get to do this for my children, for other kids like them. And I think that, you know, hopefully one day soon, we're going to have so many more versions of our stories out there, that, you know, no one author will feel that they have to tell everyone's story.
Yes, wouldn't it be so freeing for a Muslim author to just be able to write a story and not have to bear the burden of billions of Muslims around the world and have to represent them. Sabina, what I loved about your two books, though, is that you have Rukshana's narrative and you have Zara's narrative. And in so many ways, you take the story of Rukshana and flip it on its head in Zara's story, which just goes to show that even within the one same community, you can have complete polar opposite experiences, even whilst navigating very similar issues, which is so important as part of the wider project, I suppose, of disrupting these very boring, tired tropes and singular narratives.
And I wanted to add one more thing. I also, people might see, like Sajida was saying, people might see Muslims as terrorists or Muslims as ultra, conservative. And I wanted to really write stories about teenage girls who, while being Muslim, are also living their lives. They're going to school, they have dreams and aspirations, they're falling in love, they're grappling, and they're coming to terms with their identities. And I think those are real people. We don't all just have, like, you can't just slap a label on a person and then expect them to fit into this little box that you have constructed for them. We need to allow them to live just like normal, regular teens all over the world. And that, I feel like that is what's happening. And people are struggling with some parts of their, in some areas of their lives, and in other areas of their lives, they're thriving. And those things can happen at the same time. They do happen at the same time, especially for teens and young people who are just starting, they're just starting out starting out with their lives and fulfilling their dreams and pursuing their ambitions. And it seems so unfair to put so many restrictions on them based on labels that are just not, they don't encompass all their attributes. And so I think that's really important, to allow them just to be young and hopeful, and to experience all the wonderful things that all teens experience around the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sabina. Can I come to you, Sajida?
Yes. So for me, in my narratives of, both of my novels, especially Saints and Misfits, which my debut novel looked at the issue of sexual assault in a faith community. But for me, I actually root my my interest in looking at these issues in my faith as a Muslim, because it tells me to stand forth for justice, whether it's against you or for you. So so when I look at these issues, I look at it from a lens of justice. Like, do we say something like sexual assault doesn't happen in our communities? No, it happens in every community. As we saw from, the rise of the Me Too movement in, recently, how it's something that so many people grapple with and should be talked about. Or, so do we come from a place of truth and also approach it from a place, from like the issue from a space of love and warmth for communities. So that's where I kind of I start from. And I'd also like on this topic, I'd like to point out something that I experienced was that, because sometimes people ask me, like, have you faced any, any like critiques and criticism from Muslim communities? And when I set out to write the story, I didn't even think of that. Like, I just didn't assume that there would be anybody who would ask me, why did you write this, or why did you focus on that? Because I grew up in communities, like, I'm very close to my faith communities, and I grew up in communities that actually talked about these issues. And there was an openness. So I never really thought that, expected that or even considered it. But then as soon as the advanced review copies of my books went out, I received, some feedback like that, like, why are you looking at this? And when I looked at, when I processed what was happening, a lot of the critiques and criticism came from people who don't center their faith, who actually connected to the faith through cultural kind of frameworks that really put it in terms of in terms of the greater society. What would the other people think of us vis-a-vis, their scrutiny that the Muslim communities have faced. So it came from those, but Muslim faith communities have actually embraced Saints and Misfits, and the look at it, at sexual assault in our communities. And several prominent Muslim organizations and Muslim scholars actually use it as part of initiatives to, look at eradicating abuse in spiritual settings. So it's used across North America. So I wanted to point that out because like that's just something that was like I didn't expect in terms of the scrutiny. And then it was really affirming for me to know and understand that there are so many people who see these issues as not like airing dirty laundry or anything. It is, they see it as issues of faith and justice and truth. So I just wanted to add that little piece as well.
How incredible. What a privilege it must be to know that you've not only put an incredible story out into the world, but that it's being used as a tool to actually eradicate the very injustice that you have centered in your text. How incredible. So I'm just going to remind the audience at this point, I think it's probably a good idea that if you have questions for our panelists, you can put your questions into the question form below this video. And I'm sure people are very intrigued by all the titles that we are mentioning. So you're able to, I believe there's a tab above this video as well that allows you to go off and make purchases of all the titles that are being mentioned by our panelists today as well. Hanna, I'd like to move on to your story, focus on yours a little bit more as well now. So stories often make a wonderful way to sort of commemorate and introduce to a new generation histories that may otherwise be lost. Your story, Hanna, is based in Malaysia and could be considered a historical fiction because it's set during the 1969 sectarian violence that erupted in Kuala Lumpur between the Chinese and the Malay residents. For me, when I was reading this book, it was a real education because this was not something I knew much about at all prior to reading your book. And, you know, I like to try and think of myself as somebody who's widely read and somewhat familiar with contemporary Muslim history, but, you know, it was such a real education. And I was curious to know then from you, what are the lessons that you wanted to impart to your readers? What were the lessons you want your readers to leave your book with, especially with regards to how it can inform their own sense of self and purpose in the world today?
So first of all, I wouldn't blame yourself for not knowing this particular part of history because you have to understand that Malaysians themselves are not well educated on this part of our history. This is not a thing that we are comfortable with talking about, and it's often a part of history that gets swept under the rug, even though we still live with the repercussions of it till today. But so I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't beat yourself up about not knowing it. Like a lot of people don't know it even here. Second of all, I know it's just a turn of phrase when you say, what lessons did I want readers to take away from this book? But I'm a bit hesitant to say that I wrote this book thinking that I was going to impart lessons on readers. First and foremost, I wanted to tell a story of my people. I didn't necessarily go into this wanting to educate anybody on anything, although I'm very grateful if it made people want to learn more about my country. Also, if you've ever met a teenager, you know that the idea of a story that imparts lessons or preaches or condescends to them in any way is guaranteed to make them run away in the opposite direction. They don't like being condescended to, and they are very quick to tell you that they don't like being condescended to. So I try and stay away from saying that I wrote a story to impart lessons. But what I did want people to take away from The Weight of Our Sky was twofold. The first was that I really just wanted teens who live in this intersection of faith and mental illness that is so rarely discussed, this intersection of faith, mental illness, and culture that is so rarely discussed, to feel seen. And that's really one of the first things that I wanted to do. It's so rare that when you exist in a very specific intersection like that, that books reach out to you and reflect your experiences. And I really wanted that, The Weight of Our Sky, to be that for teens. But second of all, in regards to the historical aspect of it. And yes, it is historical, because I hate to tell you this, but at this point, the year 2000 is historical fiction for YA. And I hate saying that because it makes me feel so old, but 1969, definitely historical. But I come from a culture where we are taught not to question. And I think it's really important to know that we must interrogate our own history, whether it's our personal history or the histories of our communities, the histories of our countries. We must interrogate our own history. We must interrogate our scars and our traumas, and we must sit with our discomfort in order to move past any of it. And in the case of 1969, I'm not sure that Malaysia has really collectively done the work to do that so that we can move past it. And I really wanted to immortalize the emotions of the time for a generation that may grow up knowing even less about that time than I did. So that's what I intended to do. Whether I did that successfully or not is, of course, up to the interpretation of the reader. But yes, it was a very heavy story to write and to inhabit for so long, both in the mental illness aspect and the race aspect of it all. And since then, I have not found it in myself to inhabit that same space again when it comes to writing stories. But I'm glad that it continues to resonate with readers.
Thank you, Hannah. I mean, I know when I finished reading your book, I ended up going down a YouTube rabbit hole. And it's incredible because all the places that you mention, the cinema, the streets, the sports stadium that's turned into a refuge center, I mean, they're all still there. And there are people who survived. I mean, 1969, yeah, on the one hand, it does feel like, you know,
it feels like ages ago, but really when you think about it, it was just over 50 years ago.
That's right.
And so people are still alive who lived through it. People are still living with the repercussions of it. All these buildings, all these places, all of them are still there. And so it's not as far off as people would pretend or have you believe that it is.
Right. And that's the wonderful thing about your story, about your book, The Weight of Our Sky, because all these conspicuous reminders of this history that took place not that long ago are brought back into the light, and their relevance and what happened is reignited for a new generation. So I have a question for all three of you. YA literature, I think for a long time in many ways has been a little bit patronized, but we've seen a real embrace of some of the most important social justice movements and issues in our time by the genre. There are many Muslim youth, you know, sort of who embody this kind of third space where the impact of being a hybrid of both sort of inherited traditions and cultures and the adoption of new and in many ways foreign traditions, practices and cultures sort of merge. Muslim youth often take up a central space, you know, albeit complex at times, in politics and activism. And we're seeing that right now in full force. And each of your books reflects this reality in their own unique ways. So again, I'm coming back to sort of the landscape, the YA landscape. What was the YA landscape when you first arrived on it like? What are some of the ways in which it has grown? And what are the directions in which you would like to see it go further in terms of Muslim representation? So if this time I could start with Sajida.
Sure. So when I first arrived, I guess in terms of publishing, it would be 2017 when my debut novel was published. Up until then, as somebody, you know, who sought out Muslim characters in books, is very sparse in terms of the North American context. Very sparse that we saw anything that was like helmed by a Muslim. And I would say that, you know, in that first, like, I think that year that I was published, there was a lot of narratives coming out centering BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color narratives. And what I know from like just seeing, you know, the changes and stuff is that a lot of those narratives centered pain and trauma. And, you know, we can't cast like a negative light on that at the same time, because these are things we needed to process. Like, you know, having just been gate kept out of the industry for so long, it wasn't a surprise that there was a lot of explorations of our trauma as marginalized peoples. So that was the first kind of like, I guess, like, since the We Need Diverse Books movement really, you know, actually demanded that the publishing industry open the doors in 2014, to like when the first kind of, you know, fruits of that movement was becoming published. There was a lot of that centering. And there was also this like, and it happened in Saints and Misfits, there was also this like explanatory kind of narrative that we knew that was like, had to be suited to the dominant gaze. And I actually, because my background is in creative writing, and I had amazing professors who told me to write really unapologetically. And when I try to do that with Saints and Misfits, my non-Muslim critique partners were asking for a lot of context. And I realized that though in, you know, in maybe academic settings, there is that, you know, that permission to be more, I guess, free of that. When you came to mainstream publishing, you had to do a bit of like, kind of like make sure that the narrative was accessible to as many people as possible. And so you, in Saints and Misfits, you'll see little things like halal means this, like just slid in, right, in context. And I didn't really like doing that, but I had to do that. And you see that with a lot of the narratives. And then now there's a shift because conversations shifted. And one of the biggest conversation shifts that I'm sure Sabina and Hanna remember is people talking about the fact that you had all these like, you know, writers like J.R. Tolkien who can, you know, not explain Elvish, which is a made up language, and just slide it in and expect readers to do the work of like just figuring it out. And why we as living peoples could not just do the same thing and expect, you know, readers to come a little bit more, you know, aware and, you know, just ready to do the work of understanding our narratives. So there was a shift from my debut novel to when my second novel came out, Love from A to Z, where I actually didn't explain anything. I actually used Arabic words in my book and without explanations. And I love the fact that there was no, like almost no reviews from non-Muslim readers that said that they didn't like that. They actually liked it because the conversations had shifted. And, you know, like Sophia, you talked about how YA literature sometimes, you know, that space is looked patronized and looked down upon, but it's really the space where there's a lot of activism happening to shift readers and to shift just the reception of literature. And that's where that's happening. So in terms of what I'd like to see, obviously, is, you know, a widening of like what's kind of permitted to be published from BIPOC creatives. And we see that now with like Stories of Joy coming out more. Hanna was part of the anthology Once Upon an Eid that came out last year. And like, that was like a focus on joy. Though Hanna and I, we both kind of wrote sad stories. Like, I was like, oh, I'm the editor of this joyful anthology, and here's an example of the story of a mother who's passing away from cancer. But like, I think that it's still like that shift was being talked about, but you know, we needed to see a widening of what people, you know, whatever writers want to write about, let it be, and not let the publishing, like hopefully the publishing industry will come to our stories with a lens of like, oh, okay, there's so many hundreds of narratives of white characters taking a road trip to find themselves, and why can't we have those? And why can't, like, I know there are those now coming out and there's in the recent years, but like, just if we don't have to offer the monumental like stories that's the only things that we can publish. Let us publish everything, and that's what I'd like to see that shift.
I suppose it's tricky, right? Because publishing is still so white. So they themselves cannot always predict how well a book like yours would land in its audience. And so there's still that underrepresentation of people of color, of Muslims, and people from other faith traditions taking up space within publishing in roles other than as authors as well. That's still to be combated, I suppose.
Can I just add?
Yeah,
I just wanted to add that that's one of the things that I'm really happy to see is there's so many awakened audiences now, because publishing did have this sense that who's going to want these stories, but due to we need diverse books saying we need these stories, and then the rise of diverse like audiences that have like risen up to say yes, we will buy these books and we're here. That's also like like shifting people's in the industry, their understanding of these books.
I mean, Sajida, your book was, I think, probably the first YA book that I read with, by a Muslim author and unapologetically with a Muslim narrative. And I was sending screenshots of your book constantly to my mom, to my brother. I handed it to my daughter. I was like, and it opened up so many conversations, because, conversations that we didn't feel that we were able to even have before. So yeah, and then of course now I've had the pleasure of reading Hannah's book and Sabina's books. Hannah, if I could come to you with the same question.
Sure. You have to understand though that I came to American publishing from a very different perspective and a different environment. I came from outside publishing completely. I don't have a degree in creative writing, and before I had never even thought about writing novels, to tell you the truth, until I hit a certain age. And so I hadn't really been part of the YA community online. I hadn't been part of these conversations as much. And so it was a little jarring for me to come in to this and realize how much history of the YA community that I was having to learn in order to know my place in it and what I wanted my place in it to be. So I come from Malaysia, where as a Malay Muslim woman, I am in the majority, and I have privilege dripping out of my ears. But then I came into US publishing, where I am visibly a minority. And for the first time, I became a person of color, which I have never been before. So to learn all of this and my place in this history was it took a little bit of effort on my part to figure that out. And I was very grateful and very lucky to have people like Sajda and like Aisha Saeed, who were there to answer any questions that I might have had. I slid into Sajda's DM so many times with like questions and complaints, just like, why is this industry like this? And I was very grateful to have these people who are willing to bring the ladder back down, and pull me up with them. And in terms of the cohort that I debuted with, I debuted in the same year as Sabina, but we also had Nafiza Azad debuting with us. We had Hafsa Faisal debuting with us. And it was just so cool to see the diversity of stories that was coming out. And it's just as Sajda said, I am so excited to be part of this wave where we are more and more being allowed to write stories where we simply exist, and where we are not obligated to mine the depths of our pain and trauma for the audience, and where we may we no longer hear the words, "This is not going to be relatable to the audience." May we no longer hear those words again, because there's no reason to hear them. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about my upcoming YA novel that's coming up next year, and this segue makes it sound like I'm really here to plug my book. I'm not. But one of the reasons I'm so excited about Queen of the Tiles is that it's a murder mystery set at a Scrabble tournament, and it just happens to have a main character who is a hijabi and who is a practicing Muslim. It's not the core of the story. It's not about her identity. It's not about any of that, but she's front and center in the narrative, and she gets to solve mysteries. And that is the coolest thing to me, that I'm allowed to do that now. I don't have to keep writing stories where I have to interrogate my trauma all the time. That is exhausting. I don't want to exist to be someone's window, or to be someone's PSA, or to be someone's life lesson or trauma porn. I don't want to exist like that. I want to be able to tell stories the way other authors are allowed to tell stories. And I tell some good ones. Just going to put that out there.
Wouldn't disagree with that. Sabina, if I could come to you.
Of course. So I will echo everything Sajida and Hanna said, obviously. And I, when I came to the YA, when I read my first YA novel, as growing up as someone who, we didn't have the YA category when I was growing up. So I went from children's books to adult books, and, sort of never got to see a character at that age, even though I was at that age. But when I first read a YA book with my daughter, who was reading something, and I wanted to kind of be able to talk to her about it, what really struck me was how bold and fresh the voice was. And to hear, to learn, as I learned more about the YA community, to find out that people look down on YA, as, I don't know, immature. It just struck me as so strange, because I found those characters to be so brave and willing to just, head on face the issues of the day, and, really just be so honest and just out there with their thoughts and their feelings, and just to live like that. And so that was really something. But then at the same time, obviously I didn't find, my daughters couldn't find any books where they could see themselves. And so that was really hard. And then to compound that, as a queer teen, my daughter couldn't find any books that reflected her upbringing. There were no books about children who come from interfaith households like my daughters do. And so there are still so many specific identities, that I wish that, we will see, in the future, very soon. And I find, like Sajida mentioned, like my first book, I had to be a little bit cautious and conscious of having to explain certain things. So I would sort of, the family is Bangladeshi, so they speak English in a different way. Even if they're fluent in English, it's the wording, the phrasing, it's different when it's not your mother tongue, and so it's normal for their their phrasing and the way they speak, and not just the accent, but literally the word order, to be different, because sometimes they're translating it from their mother tongue, from Bangla. And so for me, it was important that the parents sound the way people sounded. All my uncles and my aunts that I grew up with, they don't sound like Americans, so, and Rukshana does, because Rukshana grew up here. And so those things were important to me. And I'm very glad that I'd never really got any pushback from my publishers or my editors in any way saying that, oh, this is grammatically incorrect, because to make a Bangladeshi immigrant family sound exactly like Americans do, just to me seems unrealistic, because there is a bit of a difference. And some people adapt to a language much better than others do, but nevertheless, there is some difference. And with my second book, with Zara Hossain, I just went all out. I mean, they're a Pakistani family. They speak Urdu to each other. So for them to speak only English, again, isn't realistic. I mean, in my own family, we speak English plus other languages. So we go back and forth. And that's what, in my mind, that's what they sounded like. And I really didn't bother to translate. I mean, there's Google, people can use it. I don't see the need. And, the readers, I'm assuming they're, I'm assuming they're smart people who can just find out and do a little bit of research if you're confused about something. I mean, you learn something new. It's an amazing thing. I mean, I like reading books where they use words and phrases that I'm not familiar with, because then I can learn something. I can, I don't know, like you go down a rabbit hole of really interesting stuff. And who doesn't want that? And so I was really happy, because I also didn't get any bad reviews, really. In fact, I got praise for it. I've had people saying they actually enjoyed, the fact that this family was speaking to each other in Urdu frequently, because then it felt realistic to them. It gave them a view of a family who happens to be immigrants from Pakistan, and how they talk to each other and how they interact with each other. And I think people like that. People like to have a realistic view. I did read one review where the reader was upset because I used so many foreign, or a word in this strange foreign language, but that's just something, you can't do anything about that. But the majority of people really enjoy it. And so it's really nice to be able to go, to be able to see so many books that have come out and that are coming out, where you see all these kinds of, identities being explored. And as for what I hope for the future, I hope that one day we can write books about vampires and unicorns and everything that other people have gotten to do, where the characters just happen to be Muslim and not white. And it's just something that for the focus to not be on that part of their identity, but rather as adventurers and explorers, and just kids having fun and living their lives, and not having to constantly explain and really dig into their struggles as a Muslim or as a South Asian, and just to let them be, just to let the characters live a life. And I mean, not to have to hear that, oh, you can't write about vampires because vampires are kind of done. But Muslim vampires are not done. They haven't been done yet. So many different stories that Sajida mentioned road trips and things like that. I mean, we get to have those stories as well. And why should we not, things that we read growing up, or things that really interest us in YA, that we want to write, but our versions of it. And I think those would be unique stories that readers will want to have access to. And I think, it looks very hopeful that, more and more of such stories are coming out. So I think, it's the forecast is very positive, I think, even though there are still lots and lots of issues to overcome. And, it's very slow. It's extremely slow, the number of books that come out by authors of color about characters of color, but at least it's happening. Because when I started out, it was literally, I think I found one book with a queer Muslim character, and that was it, and so it's or just Muslim characters in general, South Asian characters. I mean, it was really, really hard to find. Like, there's no way that you would go to a bookstore and find a shelf full of them or anything like that. So hopefully very soon we can walk into a bookstore, and if you're a queer Muslim kid, if you're a kid who likes vampires, if you're a kid who likes hobbits, whatever, you can find a book that's suitable for you, that is something that you would want to read.
I think it's also, if I could just cut in
go ahead.
for a little bit, I realize what we're working with some time crunches here, but I think it's also important to note that it's not enough to simply bring these books to market. We need publishing to put marketing dollars behind Muslim stories and behind BIPOC stories, because chances are these books might exist and might have existed for a long time. But we're not talking about books that are underrated. We're talking about books that are undermarketed. Mm-hmm. And I think if publishing is to really put its money where its mouth is, and we've seen so much talk of diversity, we've seen so much talk of bringing more of these stories to the table, it's not enough to simply bring us to the table. You have to allow us to compete. And to allow us to compete, you have to put marketing and you have to put budget behind these books.
Absolutely.
And I also wanted to bring up, sorry, very quickly, I also wanted to bring up the fact that is something we haven't really touched on, which is that there are a lot of really talented Black Muslim authors out there who have never received their due and who are not getting the publishing spotlight the way that they should. And in light of how much publishing has spoken about standing up and about Black Lives Matter and about representation, I would hope that in the future, more Black Muslim authors will receive that kind of spotlight, even the kind of spotlight that we have right now.
Yeah, I also wanted to add that piece, because that's a huge gap in our community's representation in popular culture, and publishing hasn't seen that like as a gap. And so Hanna, thank you for mentioning the marketing part, because while publishing has shifted to opening up to more stories, diverse stories, they haven't applied the equity lens on it. So in order to actually make up for the fact that we have, we were gate kept out, there should be actually more marketing put into our narratives to bring it up to like all the gap that's been like, the gap that we've suffered. And so until like, and now that there's more BIPOC publishing professionals, getting to those higher decision-making spots, we're slowly seeing that shift. And I know that like all three of us, I think, have seen some exciting new things happen for our stories. And Hanna, I'm so looking forward to that mystery. Like, that's amazing. It feels like a win for all of us to be able to write like a murder mystery. Yeah, so I'm excited what's to come.
I also wanted to add one little quick thing. It's important for publishing to realize that if one house has a book about a South Asian queer thing, or a road trip from, with a character who's either South Asian, Muslim, whatever, that doesn't mean that they can't have another one, because those two stories are not going to be alike. And if a single publishing house can put out books, multiple books about similar themes for white authors, then really, I mean, we are not even anywhere near having similar stories. I mean, really, I haven't heard of a single story by an author of color that's anything at all similar to something else that's come out. We're a long, long way from having too many road trip stories, or too many love triangle stories, or too many anythings. We were just starting out. And so and I've heard that as recently as just a few years ago, when I was on sub with Rukshana, a publisher came back and rejected it because they already had a book about a Bangladeshi Muslim character. And when I found out about what book that was, it was literally nothing to do. The only similarity was that their parents were both from Bangladesh. Literally, there was like nothing at all. And so it's so ridiculous that that's still an excuse that people think it's okay to use to not publish something. So yeah, that's all.
So basically, we're asking for a Muslim unicorn story to come out very soon.
With vampires.
Yes. With vampires, yes.
So I've got questions, and I'm very aware of how little time we've got left now, actually. So maybe if we could just very, very briefly respond to a couple of those questions, would that be okay? Okay, so I've got one here from Zahra. She's asked, what kind of questions would you suggest English teachers or extracurricular writing activities in schools could ask or put into place to really encourage students from diverse backgrounds, religions, cultures, etc., to embrace their lived experiences with confidence to write about them? I'm so sorry, I know I'm giving you just like 1 minute each to answer such a huge question. Or maybe I could ask one of you to answer that question, then we could take one more question. So yeah, can we do that? Is anybody burning to answer that question? I know you are. Go on, just say it. Go on, Sajda.
I'm just thinking that if it's like in terms of creative writing, just having an open space in in your classroom and bringing in diverse reading, like reading literature, like literature samples, so that whoever the kids or students see that there's so much diversity in the ways that people live their lives, and they should be then feel like they have a spot in it. And I'm saying this because until I went to university, I hadn't, like in my high school years, I never seen non-white authors, and only when I went to university did I have that experience, and that gave me the permission to write my lived experience, because then I saw that, oh, it can be done, and it's done. And that was like, not explicit way that I was told, but it was just by the experience of reading others. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. There is another question here, just about from Syra. It is directed to you, Sajida. So sorry about that, but she's asked about the research process into your books and how you went about ensuring that your story was written in a way that considers our faith, and whether what you're putting out into the world is going to be beneficial rather than harmful in terms of negatively influencing a young audience. Maybe that's with regard.
Oh, okay. So that's
yeah,
about my YA novels. So in terms of research, if it's about topics that are outside of my lived experience, obviously, one of the things that YA publishing really talks about is doing that authenticity, research and reads, and having that insight from people of that experience. And so for me, for Love from A to Z, there was a chronic illness rep that's part of my family, and for that I had several reads and insight, and actually rewriting of scenes and stuff from the member of my family who has multiple sclerosis. So for that, the research comes from that. And even if I have, I'm of Muslim identity, I'm not of like a convert identity. So I had, again, a person from the background that was explored in my book, a Chinese convert background. I had authenticity reads done for that. So I do that kind of research in making sure that my things that I don't know about, what I may be blind to, are have some weigh-ins. And in terms of responsibility, I do take that part. We all talked about not wanting that responsibility of representing our community through our writing, but I do take that, I do very carefully consider the fact that my stories are going to readers who haven't seen themselves and who've actually seen themselves malrepresented. I use that word malrepresented because there's a lot of intentionality to recycling stereotypes of Muslims, and it's really connected to a lot of political stuff. So I like write from that space of of like lived experience, but also a kind of care and concern for my young readers. And I think we all do, Hanna, Sabina, as YA writers. I think that's one of the reasons we're in the YA space. We care about young people. So that is, that's something I consciously, every time I sit down to write, I actually start with the dua that my impact, my words impact in a good way, and not in a way that will harm anyone.
Thank you so much to each one of you. Actually, I mean, I think we could carry on talking for another hour, but that is outside of our time limit, I'm afraid. Thank you to each one of you, and thank you to each of our viewers. And I'm just going to pass it over to Shaheen, with apologies if we didn't get to ask questions that may have come through.
Thank you all for being so generous with your thoughts and your experiences. There's a reminder just to send us some feedback, and you can also buy books via the link. We have upcoming MFest events today, we've got the Future of Cinema with Other Cinemas at 5 p.m, featuring the actors from the film Rocks, which is on Netflix. Please watch it if you haven't, it's fantastic. And we've got an event at 7 p.m. called Subverting Narratives with Nida Manzoor, who wrote Lady Parts, which is now on Channel 4 at the moment. Thank you all so much. Hope to see you later and hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.